Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm so happy and excited to see you, um, and to welcome Rabbi Marla Feldman, who's the author of Biblical Women Speak. This is the kind of book I'm always excited about because it's like great material for me to be able to teach. But what an incredible gift for us to have Rabbi Feldman here to be able to teach and tell us about what she's written about and kind of get us started on what I hope will be a continued journey. I think we're going to continue to go back to this book, and my plan is for us to actually have a class based on it. So we'll be making a group order of it. But I want to just tell you about Rabbi Feldman. She's not only the author of this book of feminist midrash called Biblical Women Speak, Hearing Their Voices Through New and Ancient Midrash. She's a Reform rabbi. She's a lawyer. She was the executive director of the Women of Reform Judaism for a super long time, and just recently became the executive director emerita. And now she serves of counsel with a law firm of Peer, Gann, and Gisler, which and specializes in clergy contracts. Previously, Rabbi Feldman was the director of the Commission on Social Action of Reform Judaism, and she was the director of development of the URJ. And before her work with the Reform movement, she served Jewish community relation councils in Detroit and Delaware, where she also taught as adjunct faculty at the University of Detroit Mercy and the Widener University College of Law in Wilmington, Delaware. And before that, she served congregations in Sarasota and Orlando, Florida. She was ordained at Hebrew Union College, and she received a JD from the University of Florida and a BA from Jewish Studies from a fine university, the University of Pennsylvania. And in addition to her book, Biblical Women Speak, she's also contributed chapters in several publications, including the Social Justice Torah Commentary. There's so much more to say about Rabbi Feldman, but I'll happily send you her bio if you want to read more about her. I'd much rather turn things over to her so that we can learn from her. I'm so grateful to you, Marla, for you being here this evening. And so I will just turn things over to you now.
Thanks.
Welcome, Rabbi Feldman.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to take a minute to share my screen with the PowerPoint. And as I'm doing that, I'll tell you, I think I need to change my bio to a certain extent because it sounds like I can't hold a job. But either that or that I'm like really, really old. But in fact, I'm sorry, I'm adjusting some things on my screen because I can't see my own screen here. I have to make myself smaller. Okay. It's great to be with all of you. I hope, can someone just give me a nod and tell me if you're seeing the proper view of the PowerPoint? Can someone unmute themselves and tell me?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes. Great. That's great. Thank you, Leah. So because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see all of you. So Bela and I think Marsha will monitor the chat if you've got questions. And with a small enough group, hopefully we can get a little bit of discussion going. What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about my book, but more importantly, I want to share with you some of the content of the book. So in a nutshell, the book is 10 chapters. Each chapter focuses on a biblical woman. And in each chapter, I've written a modern midrash, and I've given an overview of some of the traditional, what I would call classical midrash about that character, and wrestled a little bit with how do we make their story relevant for us today. So that's the book in a nutshell. But I want to start with answering the question, what is midrash? So I'm assuming that not everyone on this call knows what midrash is, and I'll be using the term quite a bit. If you already know what midrash is, great, this will be a refresher for you. So the word itself comes from the Hebrew root to search out. And it is a type of Jewish literature. So it's not like a book. It's a type of Jewish literature that develops over time, that has developed over millennia, as scholars, rabbis probed the biblical text, searched it out in order to get as much as possible out of the text. The biblical text is considered sacred literature, the word of God. So if that's the case, we want to understand it fully, and we want to parse every word. We want to understand the hidden meanings. So the rabbis from ancient days through today wrestled with questions that arise from the text in order to make it relevant for their own day and age, to understand fully what the text means, to sometimes teach us a sermon. So just like rabbis today will in their sermon riff on different texts, rabbis in ancient days did that too. And out of that riffing, if you will, often you had midrash developing as rabbis put their own spin on the text and again used the language of the text to find those deeper meanings. So as a type of literature, there are many sources of midrash. So you will find midrash in the Talmud. You'll find it in actual collections of midrash that's written intentionally as midrash, but you'll also find it in translations. A translation is interpretation. So which word you use to translate a biblical, a Hebrew word can totally change the nuance from one interpretive translation to another. So in early translations of the biblical text, the Aramaic translations from the 1st century and Septuagint, the Greek translation and others, you have midrash based on the translations of the text. And early scholars knew certain midrash stories that were as old as the biblical text, but just didn't make it into the biblical canon. So you have medieval commentaries that develop midrash or reflect on midrash that they learned from centuries before them. You've got midrash in the Talmud. You've got midrash still being written today. So it's a very vibrant, living process. And we're going to be engaged in that process to a certain extent tonight. So the essence of midrash is really asking questions. What questions arise from the text? What do we want to understand more fully than the simple language on the page we may be reading? And in different ages and different individuals in different places, we'll ask different questions. What's relevant to them, the way they read the text, different questions will bubble up for them. So there are some questions that naturally arise from the text, particularly those that are the narrative, the stories of the biblical text. So you have a story and you have the words on the paper, but not all the details are there. So there may be gaps in the text. Well, wait, what happened before what I'm reading? What happened after? What more do we know about these characters than what's actually written in the biblical text? What's missing? So that's a whole type of midrash called midrash agadah, which is the narrative, the stories, the parables, is a type of midrash that comes to fill in some of these gaps. One of the most, I guess, well-known examples of that, I'll ask you to click in the chat. How many of you have heard the story of Abraham smashing his father's idols? We getting some people saying they know that story? Well, I'm going to assume that many of you do, even if I haven't, I can't see the chat. So it's a very well, I'm seeing some yeses. Okay, thank you. It's a very well-known story, but it's not in the biblical text. That's midrash. It happens to be a very old midrash. It was very well known. And so it is repeated in a lot of the later commentaries. It's repeated in the Talmud and other places. And it naturally arose from the text because we meet Abraham and Sarah when they're adults. So the natural question is, well, wait a minute, how did Abraham come to this understanding of one God? What was it in his background that led him, of all people, to that? How did he meet Sarah? Where were they from? There's just a lot of questions that naturally arise from the text because the details are not in the text. So that's an example of midrash agadah, the narrative stories, and how midrash develops from natural questions that arise in the text. You also have a type of midrash that's called midrash halakha, which means the law, the regulations. So similarly, if you've got a commandment, perhaps one of the best known examples of this is, you shall not work on the Sabbath day. So you've got this commandment, and it's pretty broad and also vague. So what do you need to know if you want to fulfill that commandment? You shall not work on the Sabbath day. What do you need to know? We have any answers to that?
What exactly is work?
What is work? Exactly. So are you a lawyer? It tends to be the lawyers ask the question first. It seems no.
Thankfully, no.
So yeah, if you want to follow that commandment and not work on the Sabbath day, you need to know what work is. The commandment just says you shall not work. So that's a natural question that arises from the text, but it impacts how you fulfill that law. So the rabbis looking at the text saw that just before that commandment in the biblical text, you've got the story of the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And the same word for work is used. So you shall not work on the Sabbath day. The same word for work is in, here's the work that was done for building the tabernacle. So applying rules of logic, analogy in this case, the rabbis say, aha, work in this place must be the same as work in that place. And therefore, what was the work that was done for the tabernacle must be the work that we can't do on the Sabbath day. What was the work? The rabbis outlined 40 tasks. They were dyeing and sewing and cutting and chopping and those kinds of tasks. To this day, in the Orthodox community, those who follow traditional Jewish law, those are the 40 tasks that they don't do on the Sabbath day. And it comes from midrash. It comes from this intuitive wrestling with the text, applying rules of logic, in this case, 2 rules, analogy for that word and juxtaposition, because it was 2 sections right next to each other. So these just give you some examples of what midrash is, what different types of midrash there are, and how it develops over time. So, we read the biblical text every year. We reread the same things over and over again. And yet it's always different because the questions we ask of it are different. Every time we approach the text, we're different. We've had different experiences and different questions arise for us out of the text. So it continues to be a living, vibrant engagement with the text. That's the essence of what midrash is. So a more modern type of midrash that's developing in recent years is what I would call feminist midrash. And it may seem obvious that what feminist midrash is. The classical midrash, which again, from the moment the written words of the Bible were in writing, there were people wrestling with it and trying to understand it more deeply than what they saw in front of them. So it's an ancient process. But for most of Jewish history, those who were empowered to engage in that process were men. The rabbis and sages and commentators, they weren't women. Now, the midrash I find to be very creative, very insightful, very smart, and yet limited because it was only the result of the questions that emerged from the men who were engaged in the study. Doesn't mean that it's not of value. It just means it's missing. It's not the totality of the kinds of questions that might be asked of the text. Women will see different things in the text because women's experiences are different. They're going to look for answers to different questions because they're going to be interested in different aspects of the text. And particularly the women character, which is why I focus on 10 women in the biblical text. For the most part, the traditional midrash wasn't so concerned with most of the women characters in the biblical text. They for sure weren't interested in non-Israelite women, and there are non-Israelite women in our biblical stories, but they weren't part of our family tree. They weren't part of our legacy. So they weren't that important to the storyline from the perspective of, for most of history, of the male sages and commentators. Many of the women don't even have names. They were very sidelined in the story and also in the midrash, which concerned itself, they had an agenda. Their agenda was to tell the story of the Israelite saga. And they told that story through their protagonists, through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and so on. So they were much more engaged and interested in questions that involved the male role models in the story and not the women. So feminist midrash comes along. Now women have the keys to the kingdom. We study Torah like everyone else, and we're bringing our own questions and our own insights. So not only the questions, but when we attempt to answer those questions, we're developing midrash. And we're discovering the voices of women characters in the biblical text that just weren't the focus for the rabbis before. So we've got a lot of catching up to do. There are a lot of gaps. And to me, that's exciting because that's a blank page. So in my book, many of the women characters that I focus on are women without names, minor characters that are barely known in the biblical text. And we're going to talk in depth about one of those women in just a moment. To me, focusing on those that were that the rabbis, the traditional rabbis didn't talk about, that's an opportunity to be really creative. That's the blank slate that we can fill in based on our own experiences. I'm not sure what, I did something on the screen. What are you seeing now? I need someone to tell me what you're seeing.
I'm the unknown matriarch.
Okay, so I just did something I wasn't intending to do, but I'm sorry, I just need to adjust my screen. Oh. I lost my view that I was working with before.
You're on the part from Genesis.
Yeah, I know. I need to go back, and my screen is not showing me my back and forward buttons anymore. So I need to find a way to get back to the screen that lets me. I'm sorry to digress here. I'm going to have to, I think, stop my share and restart it. I couldn't, it was going forward on its own. I'm sorry to say. So I wasn't able to adjust. Oh, it's doing it again. Okay. My apologies. We'll get it together here. Share screen. Share screen. Presenter mode. Okay, so now we're back to screen one. Sorry about that. So now at least I have my buttons that I can move it forward. Okay, so sorry. Here we are. So back to what I was talking about with feminist midrash. So the upshot of my book and what I've tried to do is to link together the traditional midrash and commentaries that's so insightful and creative from ancient days, and combine that with my own modern midrash, with wrestling with the questions that arise from the text through my lens. And then imagine if I were putting myself in the shoes of these biblical women and giving them their own voice, what do I think they would have said? So the goal of all of that is really to empower others, including all of you, to be engaged in this midrashic process. So now, let me take a pause here and just see if there are any questions, because in a moment we're going to dig in to look at the character of Keturah. So do we have any questions?
Nothing in the chat. Anyone want to raise a hand? You can use that to the reaction button. You can raise.
Okay, so now while you're looking at your chats, let me ask you, how many of you have heard of the character of Keturah? Bela has? Bela, you're the only one I can see here on my screen, so.
I only peripherally, I mostly just know the name. I don't really know anything else.
So I have to say, and as I said before, I like the women that are blank slates to a certain extent. You could be really creative. So here's the background to what leads up to her story. So in the stories of Abraham and Sarah, you may remember Sarah was barren, and so she gives her handmaid Hagar to Abraham, and Hagar has Ishmael. But then once Sarah actually has Isaac, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. It's not her proudest moment. Shortly thereafter, we have the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac, when God commands Abraham with very famous phrase, take the son that you love, your only son that you love, et cetera, et cetera. It's a long phrase, and offer him up as a sacrifice. So Abraham, they take their 3-day journey to the mountain, and he almost sacrifices Isaac until the last minute, the ram stops him. And after they come down from the mountain, Abraham and Isaac go their separate ways. Sarah dies. This all happens very quickly in succession. Sarah dies. Isaac weds Rebecca. And then Abraham marries Keturah. So Keturah is Abraham's wife. Depending on how you count wives, she is either the second or the third wife. Interestingly, most of the commentaries call her the third wife, which presumes that Hagar was a wife of a kind, unless they're imagining yet another wife somewhere. And it is a question that comes up in the text. So in only 6 verses, that's all we have about Keturah. And yet the rabbis imagine that they would have been married 35 or 40 years. So this large period of time of Abraham, the patriarch, right? He's married to this woman, and yet we only have 6 verses of her story. And in those 6 verses, they get married. She has 6 sons. Though each one of those 6 sons will be the progenitor of a great nation. You may have heard of the Midianites. This is one of the most prominent. The other ones you may not have heard of. And Abraham gives them gifts, sends them off, but wills everything that he has to Isaac, and then Abraham dies. 6 verses. That's all we have about Keturah. And yet one would imagine that she was a pretty significant character. So why do we know so little about her? Well, as I said before, the rabbis were not so interested in non-Israelite women because our lineage comes through Isaac, not through the sons of Keturah. So she just was not of significant interest in the biblical storyline. You can see a picture here. I have to say that another source of midrash actually is art, because however you depict those children of Keturah or the other children, you're creating midrash. You're sharing your visualization of the biblical text, which could be very different than someone else's. So you'll see art throughout these slides. So what we're going to do now is take a few minutes. We're going to look at the actual biblical text. These are the 6 verses. And if we can generate some discussion through the chat, or it's a small enough group, you could unmute yourself. But what I want us to do is engage in that midrashic process. And to do that, you have to read very slowly. You have to imagine that every word has meaning and power, and let that word resonate and generate questions. So if we just start with that first verse here, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. What are some of the questions that arise from the text? That's a real question for you to answer.
Where did this Keturah come from? What's her background?
That's a big one. It's a glaring gap in the text. So and the rabbis, we're going to see in a moment, did wrestle with that. What else?
How did he find her?
Yeah.
How did they meet? Where was she from? What was her background?
And how old was he at that point?
Now we know that he was 175 when he dies. That's in this text here. The rabbis through midrash, they wrestle with the timeline, and they imagine that they would have been married 35 or 40 years, which means they would have been married when he was 130 some years old. How old was she? Was it May, December kind of romance? Was it romance at all? What was their marriage like?
It was a BC AD.
Yeah. Any other questions from this first verse?
Yes, was it a love marriage or could she have been sold to him?
Good question.
What concubines are we talking about?
Okay, you read ahead, but that's a great question. So for those who haven't read ahead, if you go down to the bottom, you see that last verse, but Abraham's sons by concubines, Abraham gave gifts while still living. So wait a minute, it says in the first verse, he took a wife, and then at the end, he's talking about a concubine. Those are two different things. So what are some of the questions that arise from that?
You don't not really clear what the status of the children of Keturah
Right.
were.
So what was the status of their marriage, if it was a marriage? What's the status of the children?
And also there's so many more kids.
Yeah. So what's the question that arises from that?
Are they head of the 12 tribes?
Well, what's they weren't among the 12 tribes. So what's the relationship? The 12 tribes were the sons of Jacob. But it does beg the question, what was the relationship among the sons of Abraham? So remember, Abraham had Ishmael with Hagar. He had Isaac, who he almost sacrificed, with Sarah. And now he apparently has 6 more sons with Keturah. And maybe he also has sons by someone else who's a concubine or multiple concubines.
Yeah.
You better have some daughters or it's not going to go on very far.
Well, therein lies a question. So, and I have to say, again, it's about the questions. Eventually you get to the answers of the questions, but if you start with the answers, you're really closing yourself off. But if you start with the questions, then there's a lot of possibilities. So the question being, you could say, did he have daughters? Or from the answer that you gave, where were the daughters, right? Who did they marry? So we do know that there's a discussion in other parts of the biblical text about who Ishmael married, who his wives were, who Isaac married, and where their wives were from. So that was a consideration in the biblical text. So what about their wives? Who were their wives? And how do they relate to their other brothers? Other questions. So we're going to skip some of the middle here because you've got the names basically of the 6 sons and what the nations were that then evolved from these sons. And then just to finish the text here, Abraham willed all that he owned to Isaac. So that was, if we have any lawyers here, like a bequest, right? So he, in his will for after he dies, everything he had would go to Isaac. But while he was still alive, to Abraham's son by concubines. Again, who were the concubines? Was Keturah one of them? It's a very curious text here.
I have a question.
Sure.
Jokshan begot Sheba. Sounds like a female because they only give the descendants of Dedan. And where were they? What happened to them?
Yeah, it's a good question. In the Hebrew, it's Shuah. It's not Sheba like we would think of the Queen of Sheba, but it could be. I don't know. It seems like these are all males based on the Hebrew, but it's a reasonable question to ask. So good, you're seeing, through the questions. So what were the gifts that he gave to these other sons? Were they the 6 sons of Keturah or someone else? But he gave something to someone and then sent them to the east. Why did he send them to the east? And why did he set up his estate that way, if you will, which also, leads into those questions. What was their legacy? What was their relationship to Isaac and Ishmael? So hopefully you're getting the sense of how midrash works. So really reading every word as having meaning, letting the questions bubble up, and we could spend another half hour talking about what questions. So I made a list of questions that I thought might be asked, and I think you actually got most of these. So who was she? Where was she from? Why did they get married? Was she a wife or was she a concubine? If she was a wife, then who were those concubines? What was her status? I want to know, what was their 30-year marriage like? What was her story? And, obviously, what do we know or want to know about the 6 sons? So these are some of the obvious questions, and we're going to look now at some of the classical answers to some of those questions. So who was she and what was her background? So the rabbis, by the way, these are both from collections of midrash, from other sources of midrash, and also across generations. So you will see in the midrash, you've got the rabbis or sages or commentaries talking to each other across the generations. So they're commenting on what others wrote, but it might have been 200 years ago what someone else wrote. So we're going to see that here. So the first sentence here is from the Book of Jubilees. That's yet another source of midrash. There's a period of literature called the intertestamental period, which is basically for the Jewish texts between the time that the Bible found its written form around 200 BCE and the time of the Talmud and other later writings around 200, 300 CE. So you've got literature from, and some of it is as old as biblical texts. It's the Apocrypha, the pseudepigrapha. Josephus, you may have heard of, was a Roman general, but he wrote history. And there's midrash in what he wrote, because he's telling the Bible stories as he learned them, and he's telling them with midrash, like Abraham smashing his father's idols. So that was known at the time. It just didn't make it into the written canon. The Book of Jubilees is one of these books from the Apocrypha, and there's a lot of really great stories or variations on biblical stories here. So in Jubilees, in the text, we have one answer to the question. Abraham took a third wife. So here they're counting Hagar, I assume, as one of the wives. And her name was Keturah, from among the daughters of his household servants. So that's the first part, that how did he find her? She was one of his servants, so kind of an insider. But then it goes on to say, because Hagar had died before Sarah. So what's that about? So midrash can be very cryptic, and understanding the classical midrash, you have to be a bit of a treasure hunter to find. You have to find out what question they're trying to answer, because they don't always tell you that. You have to figure out what text they're basing it on, which they don't always tell you that. It can be very cryptic. But here, what Jubilees is reacting to is a very common theme in the midrash that connects Hagar and Keturah. And part of that is based on an assumption that Abraham had been married to Hagar. She gets sent away by Sarah. Sarah then dies. So naturally, Abraham would go back to his other wife, Hagar. So the implied question, they haven't told you what the question is, but the implied question is, after Sarah died, why didn't he go to Hagar? So they're answering the question without having told you what the question is. They're answering the question by saying she had died already. She died before Sarah, so he couldn't go back to Hagar. Therefore, he needed another wife, and that was Keturah. So in this couple of lines here, you get a whole stories that could be told, and this is just one of hundreds and hundreds of sources that could be the source of additional midrash that we can play on. So one of the questions the rabbis asked, and they were somewhat obsessed about this, was about whether or not she was a Canaanite. And why is that? Because just before this story, as I mentioned, you've got Isaac being married to Rebekah. And you may remember that story. Abraham sends his servant back to the area where he came from originally to find a wife for Isaac because he shouldn't marry one of the Canaanite women. So this theme of is she or isn't she Canaanite runs through the midrash, and it runs through a lot of the biblical text about other characters also. We know that Ishmael married local women, and we know that that was displeasing. We know that from other parts of the biblical text. So if Isaac couldn't marry a local girl, so to speak, and later on we have a prohibition against marrying Canaanite women, and Ishmael displeased Abraham. So who did Abraham marry, given all of that? So Radak, that's an abbreviation for Rabbi David Kimchi. He was writing from the 12th and 13th centuries. He writes, we can be certain that he, Abraham, selected a woman who possessed good qualities. Of course, it was Abraham, so of course he had good qualities. And therefore, we assume that she was not Canaanite, because it was presumed by the 12th and 13th centuries that, well, they knew from biblical law that Canaanites were prohibited marriages, and therefore they must have been evil or in some other way not of good character, not worthy of marriage, whatever it was. So therefore, of course, Abraham wouldn't have married a Canaanite woman. But then 100 years later, you've got Rabbeinu Bahia coming along, and he says, well, no, she probably was Canaanite. And here you've got his midrash. And again, you have to figure out what the question is he's asking. So one question is, was she or wasn't she Canaanite? But what he's really asking here is, why don't we know? Why didn't the biblical text tell us her background? So this is Rabbeinu Bahia's answer to the question of why didn't the Bible tell us? The reason why the Torah did not tell us whose daughter Keturah was, Bat, whoever, was or may have been because she was Canaanite. If she had been from any other nation, the Torah would have told us. If she was Egyptian, we know that Hagar was Egyptian. So if she was Egyptian, the Bible would have said. If she was from Philistine, the Bible would have said. But Rabbeinu Bahia is saying it must be because she was a member of an accursed nation, that because of that, the Torah did not give us the detail, and that was to honor Abraham, because we shouldn't think ill of Abraham. So again, with midrash, it can be cryptic. You have to figure out what question they're asking and answering, and you have to know other parts of the biblical text to make sense of it sometimes. So it's reading the traditional classical midrash can be challenging, but I have to say the good news is almost everything is in English now. So that's a new thing. So let me just take a commercial break here for a moment and tell you, if you don't already know about Sefaria, is an online website, I'm sorry, I don't remember if it's org or .com, which has all of the traditional Hebrew texts, the Bible, the Talmud, commentaries, midrash, Rashi, Rambam, all of that in Hebrew, in English, in other languages. You can click on a biblical verse and you can get all of those commentaries on that one verse. It's a phenomenal resource. So that's the good news. It may be somewhat complicated because you have to know the text pretty well, but everything is in English and it's accessible. So I would urge you to access it. So continuing.
In the
So-
chat, someone's asked, Judy's
Yeah,
asking, how do you spell it? Sefaria.
Sefaria, Sefaria. Sephara's book.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? S-E?
Sefaria.
Okay. Thank you.
So now you've got another rabbi from the 13th, 14th century, Rabbeinu Asher, who is agreeing with Rabbeinu Bahia. Abraham had taken these women from Canaanite women. He just states it as if it's known. So he put a stake in the ground. He says she was Canaanite. Because, and here's how he then answers the question, if Keturah had been Egyptian or Philistine by birth, the Torah would have said that. But more importantly, he wouldn't have sent the sons east. He would have sent them back to Egypt or Philistine. So he's applying logic, basic logic. And that's some of these later commentaries, you really see logic coming in. And it makes perfect sense, right? Why did he send them to the east? If she were Egyptian, they would have sent him west, which was the direction of Egypt. So they must have been from the east, and that meant that they would have been Canaanite. But then Rabbeinu Asher is also responding to these other commentaries that are saying Abraham would never have done something so wrong as to marry a Canaanite. So he's jumping in and weighing in on that also. And he says the prohibition of marrying Canaanite women applied only to Abraham's heirs. And remember, he willed everything he had to Isaac. So Isaac was his only heir, not to children who would not inherit his estate. So the sons of Keturah were not going to inherit his estate, so it didn't apply. So I see, Judy, I can see your face on the screen. You look like you've got a question.
Yeah, well, it's just, I'm not happy because it is sounding more and more like the mulatto children of the plantation owner are not inherit, they are sent away. It just was.
Well, that's bringing our own,
Well, no, they're a lesser status, these other, because they're not wives, they're concubines. They may not,
well,
they're not as good.
That is the biblical heritage that we have.
Yeah,
That there were wives and there were concubines, and they had and there were slaves and there were servants and there were handmaids, right? So, one of the other chapters is about Bilhah, who was one of the handmaids, who was not a wife and not one of the matriarchs, and yet gave birth. Each of those handmaids gave birth to 2 of the 12 tribes, but they had a different status. And, from the Jewish tradition, the status was not just good and bad differences, but were they or weren't they obligated for Jewish law? And we're going to see that actually, it may not be on this next screen, but we will see that question come up. Are they obligated to follow the laws or not, these descendants of Keturah? We're going to see that question. So back to why did he marry her? He would have been like 130. There's some, actually, I find them sweet and somewhat humorous responses. So this first one here is from the Talmud, and it's looking at what else is going on in the text to answer that question of why did Abraham marry Keturah. So we've got, just before this section, Isaac meets Rebecca. Remember, the servant went and got her and brought her to him. They meet up in a place called Bahar Lahai Roi. And you may remember the story, she falls off her camel when she sees Isaac. So it seems to be love at first sight. So Rebecca has traveled to Isaac. They meet up. Isaac brings her into his mother's tent, which is kind of a symbolic thing of, she's now the matriarch of the household. She became his wife. He loved her, and Isaac was comforted for the loss of his mother, Sarah. And then immediately afterwards, we have this story of Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. So just seeing those two things together in the Talmud, they have a very simple answer. Well, after seeing his son marry, Abraham was disquieted by the fact that he was not married. He was jealous. And so it's just like seeing someone else eating and you can't eat. He was jealous. He saw that Isaac was in love and happy with Rebecca, and he wanted that for himself. And so he sought out another wife. Another answer, this comes from Radak 1,000 years later, give or take. Abraham took another wife, even though he already had 2 wives. Again, Radak is seeing Hagar as one of those wives, because he meant to keep having more children. He wanted to have more children. He wanted to fulfill the obligation, Peru or Revu, and be fruitful and multiply. So to his credit, he wanted to populate the planet, and so he wanted to have more children. So different scholars at different times are asking the same questions, and they're answering it very differently. in many ways, probably a result of what's going on in their own lives and their own world view that's leading them to some of these answers. So, was she a wife or a concubine? Just as you were saying a minute ago, the whole issue of status makes us uncomfortable, but in fact, it was a question that they asked. And so the rabbis did wrestle with what was her status. This first passage here is really interesting because in a way, it's midrash within the biblical text itself. This is from First Chronicles, which is a later book of the Bible. But here they're giving lineages of earlier chapters in the biblical text. And it says right here, the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, were so on, and repeats the names. So here in the Genesis text, it said he married her. She was a wife. And then it refers to some concubines that we don't know if it's the same person. But later on, by this point, when Chronicles was writing the lineage, it was just assumed that she was the concubine, which said something about her status and the status of her children. So again, you've got rabbis from the 13th, 12th, and 13th century coming along and saying, no, she wasn't a concubine. So here is their answer, where, again, they're responding to other commentators before them who said she was a concubine, and they're saying, no, wait a minute, she wasn't. So, and here's their answer. The Torah, and I'm sorry, if we were in the same room, I would have some of you reading, so you wouldn't be hearing my voice quite so much, but it's just a little bit harder to do that on Zoom. So this is why the Torah writes, he took a wife. So they're saying quite simply, the text says he took a wife, so she wasn't a concubine. Therefore, it means the sons of concubines have to be someone else. They're not mentioned by name. So the sons of concubines are someone else, whereas the sons of Keturah are the ones whose names are mentioned. That fact alone clearly shows that their status was superior to the sons of Abraham's concubines. So now they have no problem with an assumption that in addition to these three wives, Abraham had concubines, and they had children that we just don't know their names. So then both Radak and Rabbeinu Bahaya go on to explain, and this is telling you something about their day and age, the essential difference between a wife and a concubine. And they're explaining it in case in the 12th century you ask this question and you don't know yet. Both are exclusive partners of men with whom they live. The former, when becoming wives, have a ceremony known as the Chuppah, and they have a wedding party. The concubine doesn't have all that pomp and circumstance. So they're both, I wouldn't say monogamous because the men weren't monogamous, the women were. So they're exclusive to their husbands or the men in their life. But one has all the trappings of marriage. And then a little bit later, you've got a commentary on Rashi. The commentary is from the 17th, 18th century. Rashi was the 11th century. Scripture called her a wife because she had a ketubah. Hopefully you all know what a ketubah is, a wedding document. And it calls it, so this text is clarifying she was a wife. That's that first verse. But she was also a concubine. And how are they explaining that? She's referred to as a concubine because Abraham took her just in order to have more children for childbearing. I'm sorry, it's the reverse. Took her for conjugal relations and not for childbearing. Of course, they had 6 sons. So what this commentary is saying is she was both a wife. She was a wife by status, but she was like a concubine because he only wanted sex with her. So I think a lot of these commentaries are telling you more about the men who are writing the commentaries. But another dictum I want to share with you is a really kind of fun concept in the midrash. In Hebrew, it's ein mukdam ve'ein meuchar. There's nothing early and there's nothing late. So in midrash, you can be really creative and you can mix timelines. So of course, there wasn't a ketubah and a chuppah and all of that were much later traditions than the time of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Keturah. So it is anachronistic, but that's okay in the midrash. So one of the most famous midrashim is a story of Moses going to the Academy of Akiva and not understanding what Akiva is saying as the words of Moses. It's a really interesting, fun midrash, but you can have Moses talking to Akiva. So that's the beauty of midrash. You can be really creative. So I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions and other commentary. I just want to look really quickly at the text related to Keturah and Hagar. I think I mentioned before, there's a very strong linkage between these two characters. And some presume that they were the same, that Keturah was Hagar. So I'm not going to read the text here, which is a very early text. Midrash Tanchuma was a very early collection of midrash. But if you look at the explanation, it's a little complicated, but in the storyline, there's a lot of place names that are the same between Hagar and Keturah. So early on in Genesis 16, when Hagar is sent away, not permanently, but she runs away and then she comes back. She runs away to this place called Be'er Lahai Ro'i, which is in the Negev. Later on, when she's formally sent away after Isaac is born, in Genesis 21, she goes to Beersheba. It's another town in the Negev. So we presume Hagar is somewhere in that region. Then we know that Abraham goes to Beersheba, which is the same place that Hagar had gone, after the binding of Isaac. I told you they came down from the mountain, they went their separate ways. Abraham goes to Beersheba. So the rabbis took from that an assumption, and why did he go to Beersheba? That's the question. Well, Hagar was there. So remember that first text that said, because Hagar had already died, that's why? Well, they're assuming that everyone knows that he would have gone there to see Hagar. So he's going to Beersheba, which is the same place as Hagar was. It must be to find Hagar. And then we have the story of Isaac and Rebekah, who meet at this place called Be'er Lahai Ro'i, which is also in the Negev. So according to midrash, and this varies from one midrash to the next, either Abraham goes to find Hagar and reconnect with her, or Isaac, who wants his father to be as happy as he is with Rebekah, goes with Rebekah to Be'er Lahai Ro'i in order to find Hagar for his father. So it's rather sweet midrash that Isaac wants his father to be happy, so he goes seeking Hagar. So there's different variations of that theme. So all of these things, plus there's other connections with Hagar, lead to a very common strand in the midrash that connects these two characters. And then this last one is just Rashi's playing on the names of the letters of Keturah and what it tells you something about her character based on the letters of her name. So we're not going to have time to really talk about the sons and the gifts. There's plenty of more midrash here. I'm just going to add in some of the things that I was thinking about when I wrote my midrash. I want to know what their married life was like. I want to know what she thought about Abraham. I want to know about, was she young? Was she old? What was her relationship with Abraham? What was their relationship with Isaac and Rebekah? All we know about Keturah is she had 6 sons. So in my midrash, which is called, you can see a little bit about it, great mother of many generations, she's defined by her role as a mother. That's all we know about her. So what does that mean? If her self-definition is about being a mother, what can we presume about her life and her story? So I'll let you get the book, and I'm going to stop sharing now for a moment. Feel free to buy the book and read the midrash and my riff on who she was and what her background was, giving her a voice. Oh, thank you, Bela. I see you got Safari, you're right. So it's, what time is it? 5 to 9. I've done a lot of talking here. And again, it's a little hard on Zoom, but I want to at least give us these last few minutes to see what questions you have about midrash or about Keturah. What questions do you have, not necessarily about them, but that arise for you in the text that you would want to know if you were creating your own midrash? What other thoughts you have about what we've discussed tonight? Yeah, I see Suzanne.
I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Because I always like seeing the feminist point of view. One of the things that we've always studied is the fact that women were ignored by the men who told the stories, wrote the Bible, because the women were busy raising children, cleaning the house, taking care of the animals. They were too busy to get their stories written down, and the men ignored them because they're doing their thing. We're going to tell what we think is important. So I really am looking forward to reading your take on some of these women.
And
so
yet
thank you.
Thank you. And clearly the women were there, right? And in this case, she was there for 30 or 40 years. She was, raising those kids. She was there. We just don't know her story, but we know that she was there.
So many women. I'm looking forward to reading what you had to say, because women have been ignored.
Mark?
Yeah. Well, something that I've wondered for a long time, and I don't know if there are any midrashim on this or not, but what did Sarah think when Abraham took Isaac up to the mountaintop to sacrifice him? The Torah is completely silent on that.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would have bothered the rabbis, but I wonder if there's anything about that.
There is. It is another one of those really glaring gaps. And Sarah, of course, is a major character, so they didn't entirely ignore her. But we don't know what she was doing. What did she think? Did she know what was going on? God commanded Abraham to go up on the mountain, but did she hear that also? Did she know? Did she not know? Did he lie to her? Yes, there is midrash about it. And in fact, there's a whole strand in the midrash that's kind of reflective of the Garden of Eden, with the snake talking to Eve and trying to get Eve to do something that she shouldn't do. You've got very similar kind of story with Sarah, that the Satan, who's not evil in Jewish tradition. Satan is a one of the angels, and he's just a troublesome mischief maker. So Satan comes and is whispering in her ear and saying, do you know where Isaac is? And, what do you think is going on? So there is definitely a lot of midrash about what was going on with Sarah, not from the same perspective as I would write that. Because again, we bring our own experiences and our own expectations and our own questions. But yes, the rabbis definitely asked that question. Bela, I saw you had a question.
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's just something to share with you. I was so surprised when you said that about this woman without a name, because Janice Zelser, who's also on here, and the missing person, Helen Albertson, and I had a joint benot mitzvah, and our Torah portion was was the one where Miriam dies in one sentence, and the Haftarah was Jephthah's daughter, who had no name. And so, the first year of our preparing together was with Donna Berman, who we talked about before that, who you're familiar with Donna. And she was our rabbi at the time. And then the second year we had a new rabbi, but Donna certainly was involved in the whole celebration of the benot mitzvah. And we wrote our own midrash about Jephthah's daughter. And it was so interesting. We read a lot of what was written about her, which wasn't so much. And nobody thought of naming her. And so we didn't either, because we felt it was a significant thing that she didn't have a name and what that meant. So we talked more about that, but we wrote stories about her and we celebrated her, and we wrote an actual celebration of we made a holiday, and we made a Haggadah for the holiday, and we celebrated it many times with Donna in different places with different
Wonderful
groups. It was so interesting, and it's so interesting to I appreciate your book, because I think it's so interesting to open up the whole idea of being able to just do your own writing of stories about the stories that are in the Torah or that aren't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. That's great. I actually wrote a midrash on Yiftach's daughter, Jephthah's daughter. That may be in the next book. Yes, I think it's a great question. She goes up on the mountain. Where did she go and what did she do? I mean, it's a powerful story. It's not one of our proudest moments. But naming is a
Yeah.
really powerful thing in biblical tradition. Not having a name, giving a name, changing a name, very powerful.
So part of the ritual we did with the Seder for the holiday was asking people to name themselves or to name women who are significant in their lives. And we talked a lot about that and what that means to us as women to have these people. And a lot of people told really moving stories about really unhappy things in their lives and how a woman was significant in those stories, you know, and even either in a good way or a bad way. It was really a very interesting thing to do. So I appreciate what you're doing because
So
it's
you not only created midrash, you created a ritual. I mean, that's fabulous. That's amazing. So really happy to hear that.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Judy.
I'm curious, what started you on writing this book? What had you just had it with the rabbis? You know,
Look, I think as a rabbi, an occupational hazard is reading text, right? We tend to love reading the text. At least I do. And we read it over and over and over again, year after year. And I was very fortunate. I was, you heard from the rabbi that I, like her, went to Penn and I studied Jewish studies, and I was exposed to midrash as an undergraduate and was just amazed by it. I had never heard of it, didn't grow up hearing about it, but it was just mind-blowing to me how creative and engaging it was. And then in rabbinical school, I studied with Norman Cohn, who is a scholar of midrash, and introduced us not only to the richness of midrash, but also modern midrash. And so I took a course in writing midrash, and I've written modern midrash, my own midrash, going back to the early 1980s.
wow.
And so I've always wanted to publish my midrash, and was really blessed with WRJ, Women of Reform Judaism. I had a couple of sabbaticals that gave me the time to write, and I was also really fortunate to find the publisher as Jewish Publication Society. So in talking to the folks at the publishing house, it's an academic press. So the first thing they said to me is, we don't do fiction, we don't do collections of midrash, but we do biblical, we do text. So, they said, if you can combine your modern midrash with teaching about the traditional classical midrash, that's a winner. So I wasn't really planning to write the book as it became, but I'm glad that I did. It was, it's one thing just to sit down and imagine a character, but when I write midrash, I come to it in different ways, but most of the stories in the book started with really learning from the rabbis. So as I said, I don't always agree with them. I don't always think they're asking the right questions, but there's so much to learn from their perspective. What were they wrestling with in 13th century Spain or 11th century France? What questions were they asking? And I discovered so many interesting elements of these stories from there. So starting with that foundation just added a layer of richness that I wouldn't have had I not really deeply engaged in the study along with creating my own then answer. So when you read the book, what you'll see, we wrestled frankly with the order. So we put the modern midrash first, the classical came second. Originally, it was the reverse. So, we went back and forth on that. But when you read the classical section, there are so many things that are in it that are in my midrash. And what I want people to know is I didn't just make this stuff up. I mean, someone did, but things that may seem really fanciful, I didn't come up with it. That's in the classical midrash. That's what they said. And I just picked up on those threads and they found their way into my midrash. So I just feel really blessed to have had this opportunity to work with the publisher, and the editors were really great, and to be able to do something I've wanted to do a really long time.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Judy. We do want to be mindful of time because some people have to stick to that.
Yeah, so I see it's after 9. I was hoping the rabbi might be able to join us back, but I guess she's engaged with the Boy Scouts.
Yeah, me too, but yeah, that's kind of important. So we appreciate that she's
Yeah,
doing
of course.
And Rabbi Marla Feldman, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about your book. And I know many of us are going to be looking for it right now and getting a copy of it.
Well, I think you saw it. So it's Biblical Women Speak. It is, if I haven't already, I'll give the rabbi, I have a discount code if you order it from Jewish Publication Society. You can get a 40% off. She can get a deeper discount if she bulk orders for your class. So you talk to her, I think, before you order, because you'll see what she plans to do. But you can get a Kindle version on Amazon, but that's the full retail price. So I hope you take the class. I'm so delighted to know that she's going to use the book as a basis for your class. And I just want to reiterate what I said early on. One of my overarching goals is really to empower all of you to be engaged in this process, to pick up the biblical text, to read it with midrashic eyes, to let those questions bubble up, and then to start thinking about how you would answer some of those questions. So I hope you will engage in the process.
Thank you so much.
All right. Good night, everyone.